Hello, and thank you for joining Donovan Evans Tutoring. Today's video is centered around maximizing Desmos in the digital SAT. I thought that it would be an important thing to add to the growing digital library at Donovan Evans Tutoring to have this video so that students can know how they can best maximize their use of Desmos while on the SAT. I want to clarify just a couple of things in terms of when to use it and make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of what the capabilities of Desmos that you might want to consider during the exam and in what ways you want to limit our expectations in terms of the use of Desmos as a tool. We want to note that Desmos is added as a tool, not as a be all end all to solve all of your problems on the SAT. So that and a few other things what we'll discuss today. Note here just a legal disclaimer. All right, so why does Desmos matter on the digital SAT? So it's been integrated on the SAT since March of 2024, and it's become a growing question within the tutoring base of students that I usually work with. I wanted to make sure that as we're ending 2025, that I have something in terms of evergreen material that I can always reference for students so they can best utilize how to use Desmos. Obviously, in our one-on-one sessions, I can make additional recommendations, but this would be more of a broad stroke. So there is a speed advantage in terms of using Desmos on the SAT. It is said that it can speed up maybe about 15 to 20 problems. But I want to note that when we're talking about speeding up, we're more so talking about computation, but that computation is happening after you've already set up the problem. So it's not going to add any strategy to you, but it can assist in terms of streamlining some of your computation along the way. Okay. As was quoted in Hello College article, it can be a proven approach in order to increase your accuracy, right? So if computation and moving through, we'll say some of the longer math processes is a challenge for you, this could be an advantage for you, right? It's particularly ideal for different things in terms of functions, intercepts, systems, inequalities, quadratics, and scatterplots. And we'll take a look at a few of those here today. Okay. Now, I'm not going to read all 10 of them, right? But these are the things that Desmos will not do for you, right? But in sum, one of the most important things that I want you to have in mind as you're going to take your test is you need to remember that it's not going to do the thinking for you. If you put bad information into the system, it's going to give you bad information back. So it's still very important to make sure that you remember all of your math principles, everything from your basic algebra to your basic geometry, from your fundamental formulas, um, to the concepts that you'll need to interpret when looking at the information that it gives back. So I just want to note that it's not going to solve all of your problems, but it can help along the way, especially if you've given yourself a good framework and a good foundation in terms of approaching each question. All right. Now, these are problems that we would classify as more ideal for Desmos, right? I'm not going to list through all of them, but as you see, a lot of them relate to functions, equations, features of equations, solving systems, inequalities, and then different metrics in terms of statistics. So we'll take a look at how we can use Desmos in a couple of these arenas, but I want to note when working with Desmos, you still have to make sure that you set up things properly. And if you've set them up properly, then Desmos is the perfect tool to help make efficient use of your time during your exam. All right. And so now I want to just kind of take a look at the overall interface. These are some of the areas in which we will work today in terms of this video. I don't expect this video to be too long. Um, but let's just take a look at the interface itself, make this a little bit wider. Okay. Actually, might be too wide. All right. So this is just your initial screen that you might see when you open up to use Desmos, either inside of the SAT or outside of the SAT. One of the first things I always want students to be cognizant of is what window are we looking at, right? It's very well that you might input something into your equation, and I'll show you where we're going to insert that now, and we'll go through some practice examples. But it's not uncommon for a student to place information into the system and then wonder, well, where is it? You always want to be cognizant of where your window is. When we press the home feature as we move around, you might return you back to this home setting. Um, and I'm not particularly sure what the parameters will be exactly on the SAT. If it is the same +5, -5 on the y-axis and -10, +10 on the x-axis. But nonetheless, you want to make sure you're cognizant of it. Another tool before we go and look at where we'll input our data and equations is our graph settings, right? I want us to be very cognizant of this. And as you see, here we have those parameters that would represent our home setting in this particular instance. But there's one particular feature that I need us to be cognizant of in the event you end up using Desmos to assist with some of your trigonometry, is to understand what setting you're in terms of degree and radians. So just like any other scientific calculator, any other graphing calculator, it's important to know that, given that if you decide to input your sine, cosine, or tangent, you need to understand what your angle measurement component is set into, either radians or degrees. Do I have a preference in terms of how you should set that? No. It's really going to be based on the problem. It's going to be based on your level of comfort. But I want you to be cognizant of where you will find that information. Okay. And then last but not least, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, over to the left is where we'll be placing and inserting a lot of our information. There will be a little bit of shorthand that I'm not going to go over a ton other than the components or the commands that are relevant to this presentation, that are relevant to, I'll say, the higher yield uses of Desmos. If we press this +X button, we might see different instances in terms of placing an expression, adding a note or a table. I say image and folder, probably less relevant in terms of the SAT. And then likewise, in terms of this keyboard module here, you'll see that we have some additional components, including inserting X and Y variables, a default button for square, and then exponents and what have you. Also want to note that we have some of our functions, particularly our trig and our trig and statistic functions here that might become helpful, just in case you don't remember the shorthand, right? I'd say calculus is a little bit less likely, right? But some of these other components, particularly in the stat realm and in the trig function realm, might be pretty helpful for us, right? So let's go back. Awesome. So section 1, let's just take a quick glance looking at linear and function graph basics. Okay, so in terms of the basics, it can be helpful in terms of asking you questions about intercepts. So again, you should be coming in with an idea of what intercepts mean. For the sake of this video, I will note that we should remember our x-intercepts versus our y-intercepts. And our x-intercept is where our graph crosses the x-axis, or it's our x value and y is 0, and our y-intercept will be the inverse, right? So it's wherever our function crosses the y-axis, and it is our y value when x is equal to 0, right? So that's the knowledge that we have to come into, but we can take a look and see how Desmos can help us out with that, right? So let's go ahead and remember this equation. When we put this in, it's going to be y is equal to -6x minus 32. So we'll say y is equal to -6x, -6, didn't want to work. Okay. Minus 32. Awesome. All right. So as you see, I could type that in, or the keyboard function might pop up and I can input manually that way. What's the first thing that I notice? What am I looking at? Always ask yourself, what am I looking at? Whether it's Desmos or even if you're dealing with a question, it's one of my forefront strategies. What are we looking at? So as you see here, I'm looking at what looks like a blue line, which seems consistent with the marker they gave me to show that this is my function. But do I see everything? Especially if we're talking about looking for intercepts, right? And I don't, right? So I'm zooming out and I'm also clicking to toggle the screen. And I'm noting that now I have both X and Y intercepts in view, which is a good thing, right? So, but I need the data associated with it. So how can I get that? Go ahead and click on the line itself, right? It seems very fundamental. I understand a lot of you probably, I do this all the time, but nonetheless, I want to make sure I go over everything. So let's make sure we click on the line. In doing so, this allows the system to show us where our intercepts are. And even by hovering over the points, we can see again, as long as we understand which value will be 0 for each intercept, I can say that this is my x-intercept. I can say that this is my y-intercept, right? According to the definitions that we're coming in with, but now Desmos has helped us clarify that, right? So that is a quick assessment for intercepts. You can do that with linear functions. You can do that with any function that we place in. I want to make sure that we have that. Clear this, and we will be back. All right. And then another instance that might be pretty helpful in terms of using Desmos is that it can be helpful in terms of interpreting slope in a context, right? So we have here this SAT-like question where it says, a new video game system requires an initial activation fee plus the cost of each game purchased. Okay, what is the total cost of the system and X games is given in the table. So we have X games, we have total cost, and the table should reflect some information based on what they said, right? Now, obviously, the strategy is laid out here, but let's put this into practice. In terms of inputting into the table, I'll go over to Desmos. I'll open this up. If I were you on the exam, you can hit the plus button and type table, right? Or I can type table and then it populates for me, right? Let's see what goes into that table. So what's going into that table, we'll say it'll be 0, 100, 5, 225, 8, 300. So we'll say 0, 100, 5, 225, 8. It should have been 300, right? 300. All right. So as always, what am I looking at? Do I see the points that were just requested on the graph? Now, obviously, for every question, that's not necessarily the most important thing that you want to do, but I just want to note that's my default thought, and I would like for you to have that same thought. Okay. So in this instance, we've now inserted the data that we've been provided into the table. What do we want to do with that? Well, per this question, it looks like we were asked, what does the slope of the line that models this relationship represent in this context? So first and foremost, we would need to know the slope. So in terms of my hierarchy and prioritizing what I need to find, first I need to find the slope, and then I need to be able to interpret what that means. So in terms of finding the slope for this, we would need to put in a regression. And the linear regression for Desmos, and I would say any regression for Desmos, is actually fairly simple. What you want to think about is instead of thinking of your standard equations, instead of thinking of your standard equations that you might input for linear, quadratic, quadratic in standard form, quadratic in vertex form, or cubic form, whatever that standard equation is, they want you to insert that equation. The only difference is instead of putting an equal sign, we'll put the tilde. I think that's the official name for it. But nonetheless, this is the symbol that we'll place in. Now, if you notice, I placed the Y and nothing grabbed, right? It didn't really seem to activate anything. So in order for the system to recognize where you're pulling your data from, I need to say Y1. And notice when I do that, now it's recognizing where we're pulling that data from. So now we're going to say Y1, and hopefully we are remembering. I'm going to write this on the board. Hopefully we are remembering that our base level equation for linear functions is y is equal to mx plus b, right? And in doing so, we're going to make sure that that's what we place inside of our function, right? And so now the system recognizes that we're looking for regression parameters, right? We're looking to see if the linear function that we are suggesting is a good fit. Now, how do you know if something is a good fit? A very quick statistical or a very quick stat lesson. We always want to look at R squared. The closer you are to R squared equaling 1 means the more solid of a fit that you have. This thing equals 1, we're in the right ballpark, right? So that means that our slope is 25. Okay. Now, obviously, there are other ways for you to find the slope in terms of using your slope formula that you might remember, but this is another option. So this is the main point of this video, is to make sure you recognize that you have another option available to you. Now, the interpretation piece, that's up to you. right? So we need to be able to look at this and say, the slope in this context means that each game costs $25, right? So that's how we would use Desmos to link between the information that we were given, the information that we're coming into in terms of context, and drawing the connection to get to our answer and conclusion. Okay. Let's see here. Clear out that screen. All right. For the next component, we'll talk about inequalities and shaded regions. I like this a lot, in part because inequalities can be confusing to people, particularly in terms of recognizing which side do we want to shade. But I love this in terms of the use of Desmos and using a graphing calculator as a feature because it makes our lives a lot easier, right? So let's say in this situation, we've been provided this question where it says, which of the following points is a solution to this inequality? And you have four available points, right? So we could do this algebraically where we put each of these points in, see if we get an answer that's true. We don't really want to do that, right? We want to save time. If possible, we want to maximize our tools. So that said, let's take a look at what we're going to put in Desmos. So it says here, y is less than negative 4x plus 4. That's what we need to keep in mind. So y is less than negative 4x plus 4. Remember that. Y is less than negative 4x plus 4. Cool, right? What I love about this as a feature, oh, hold on. First off, where am I? Do I see everything? Obviously, everything came into view, but I want to make sure that I'm training our minds to remember what am I looking at? And so we've done that. We see the graph, we see the inequality. Great. What I love about this feature is that it does provide some aid as long as you're setting things up properly. We remembered the inequality and copy that over accurately. We are presented with a dashed inequality. So hopefully we're remembering what that means. And that means that we don't include the line, right? Because it's dashed. But if this was or equal to, then that would be a solid line. In fact, let me draw that. Let's see here. I think the best way to include or equal to would be to come to the keyboard function to make sure that you capture that, right? Right. I'm gonna pause this one just so that you can see the difference. There's no confusion. Note that this is a solid line. So when you have or equal to, we're looking to a solid line. I know I'm not supposed to be teaching math right now, but I can't help it. Nonetheless, for a solid line, that's or equal to. So back to the question at hand. So we have y is less than negative 4 plus negative 4x plus 4. Again, I like about this is we see our shaded region. And this takes a lot of the thinking out of this. So when I think about the points that I have, we have 2, negative 1, we have 2, 1, 0, 5, and negative 4, 0, right? So let me write this down. We have 2, 1, we have 0, 5, and we have negative 4, comma 0. Please excuse my handwriting. I never profess to teach anyone handwriting skills. So, what do we have here? Which one of these points actually falls in line? Beauty of this is that we can put these points in here, right? And without a lot of extra thought, do we have our point? Is that inside of our shaded region? No, right? Is that inside of our shaded region? No, right? So instead of, and if you feel very comfortable, you can instead of typing all of them in, maybe we can come down and recognize, hold on, this is negative 4, which will put us on the more shaded side, which is good, and negative 4, 0, which for sure, and this is more so for the sake of the video and conversation, that is inside of our shaded region. So that would have to be our answer, right? So this is a great tool in terms of working with inequalities, right? Um, just want to just offer that. Okay. Awesome. Let me pull out of here. Clear the screen there. Let's continue the presentation. All right. Now, system of equations, I technically could have done that with the inequalities because you could have a system of inequalities, and I'm actually going to do that for this one. But let's chat real quick. Why are systems great for Desmos, whether inequalities or equations? They are great because they can increase our accuracy in terms of intersections. Again, the accuracy in terms of intersections, because a lot of um, there's an increased risk of error with computation. That's just a rule in stats in general. The more computations you do, the more you increase your risk of error. And so Desmos is great in terms of helping us alleviate some of that risk, right? And we're minimizing some of that risk. As I'm always going to preach, this still requires you to set up your question properly. So even if we're perfectly moving from word problems, if we don't have the right equations, we're out of luck. So we still need to make sure that we set up properly, but this is a great tool in terms of saving time in this arena. I also love this for inequalities because if you have a system of inequalities, that means we're looking for a region of overlap between our inequalities, and that can help us out a lot as well. Okay, so let's take a look here. Um, so as I said before, it's important for you to make sure that you get the right equation. So I'm actually going to pause for a second, give you a second to pause, um, and see if you can come up with the equations that are associated with this particular system. All right. So hopefully, right now you have the equations sit down, or the equations are written down, right? And hopefully the equations look a little bit like this: 5.50R plus 3B equals the first store in terms of store A would be 37. And then also 6.50R plus 8B equals 66, right? Hopefully that's what you have, right? And if you don't have that, please contact me. We can work on system of equations. Um, I love working on those just because it can make life a lot easier after you have some conversations about it. Nonetheless, this is the equation that you need to have. Once you have your proper equations, my recommendation is always to at least write something down to the side so that you have a reference for what you're putting into Desmos. Remember that the parameters for your graph are X and Y. And since we have X and Y, but we have R and B here, we need to make sure we're singing the same song. So that R needs to become, maybe we turn that into X, and that B needs to become Y, right? And so when I place this into Desmos, wherever I had R, I'm going to replace that with X. And wherever I had B, I'm going to replace that with Y. I don't know why my eraser is not working. Oh, there it is. Awesome. So let's check this out. So now we have 5.5x plus 3y is equal to 37. And then we have 6.5x plus 8y equals 66. So let me clear up a lot of this stuff in terms of the written work. But we're remembering r is going to be associated with y. I'm sorry, r is going to be associated with x, and b is going to be associated with y. Let's remember that. Okay. But what do we have here? We have two lines that have been drawn with all the components that we were expecting in terms of our linear function at the very beginning. We can go in and we can see our intercepts if need be, but most importantly for our system, Desmos will automatically show you that intersection, which is great, right? So this is telling us that in order to solve for this system, we're looking at a x of 4 and a y of 5. Okay. So let's take that information back over, see if that helps us out. All right. How many pints of of blackberries, we're going to remember that our R was going to be X and our B was going to be Y. And this confirms what we had listed in terms of our strategy point, that we had 5 pints of blackberries. Okay. So again, the setup is still very important. But after that, the computation Desmos really helps us out a lot. Okay. I did want to go back. There's a reason why I did not delete everything immediately, is that I like Desmos because for inequalities, let's say that we have conditions that need to be met in terms of an inequality, right? Yeah, that'll work. So what are we going to note? Let's say that if for some reason your system involves inequalities, just notice the point of overlap, right? And that can tell you, especially like for the last inequality review that we had, if we're looking for conditions and they're supposed to meet certain parameters, they would need to be in an area where both items or both regions are shaded. And so, again, I just like that as a tool from a visual aspect, just because it's a topic that a lot of students end up having challenges seeing or being able to visualize on their own. This is a great tool to have for that. So it's clear. All right. So let's take a look at some quadratics work. Now, Desmos is great for quadratics because it automatically populates a lot of features, in particular, whenever we're dealing with maximums versus minimums, right? So let's say that we have a function that we've been provided and they want to know, hey, what's the maximum, what's the minimum of this function? In this case, we're looking at the minimum, right? So let's go ahead and put this into Desmos. Let's see, 2x squared minus 8x plus 19. Now, obviously, that's going to be the output we're expecting, but let's make sure that we can see. So 2x squared minus 8x plus 19, all right? So let's say f of x. And notice you can use y or f of x. I probably should be a little bit more disciplined in how I put into this graph or into this video, whether I used f of x or y. I will say it might be more beneficial since you are using a graphing system that might relate to, let's say, a table or data. I would say going ahead and using f of x would be a strong move. They technically or can be interchangeable, but as a default, it is a good safety measure to go ahead and use f of x each time. So we have f of x is equal to 2x squared minus 8x plus 19. And I'm going to go over and check. So my memory's not that great. All right, so there it is. So we have 2x squared minus 8x plus 19. And as expected, we were presented with the intercepts, right? Hopefully you're recognizing that your y-intercept, but also we're provided the vertex, and that vertex is always associated with our minimum or maximum. In this case, because our graph is opening upward, we have a minimum, and the minimum value here is going to be 11, right? So we just want to keep that in mind and how we can use Desmos to help us features like that, and we're off to the next question. All right. We also like this as a tool to help us figure out specific parameters, right? So this is kind of falls into the category of what we call, I believe, called as the SAT, where they give you a variable and they say, hey, what conditions do these things? Does it meet the parameters that we're talking about and all that? Yeah, that's cool. So the main thing is, what do we want to get out of it? So we have a system of sorts, where we have a system of equations that we want to apply here, but there's a unique characteristic. And it's in situation where we are saying that we want a value of b, where the parabola intersects the line exactly at 1 point, right? So this is a perfect example of when it would be beneficial to use our sliders. Now, what I've noted, both in working with students and in preparing for this lesson, is that Desmos might automatically populate the slider for you, right? If it notices that there's a variable that's a characteristic and it's a variable inside of a function that it already knows, it'll provide that slider for you. But I want you to be cognizant of whether or not that auto populates for you, and that you'll have to probably insert the slider. So nonetheless, let's see what we have here. So let's go ahead and place this into Desmos. So we have y is equal to negative 4x squared plus bx. And then we have the line that's supposed to be intersecting with is 2y is equal to 4.5. So let's check something out. So let's say that we use a y. Let's see, for the sake of what I was saying before, is equal to, let's see, negative 4x squared plus the x. Add slider, absolutely. Thank you. And then we also have 2 is equal to 4.5. 2y rather is equal to 4.5. Right? Now note that I'm getting the same line whether I input 2y is equal to 4.5 or if I move forward with the division step that would take me to y is equal to 4.5 divided by 2, right? It's the same line. So I just want to note that's another helpful aspect of Desmos, that you can place the equations in as provided in a situation like this. Great. Now, how do I use this as a reference for us, right? How do we make this slider function work, and what does this really mean? Basically, what we're saying is that we don't know what our b value is. And in fact, we want this function to change based on what a b value, what this variable could be, right? So notice how as I move it to the left, it moves that way. As I move to the right, it moves that way, right? Let's see what we have. So the goal is, according to the conditions that we were asked, our goal is to have your functions here, your line and this function only intersect once. Okay, so let me zoom in a little bit. See if we can get the contact, right? So as we note, whenever we have systems, this one is helpful because it'll show us if there's contact in more than one location, right? So let's see what we have here. So when I move this over to the left, so let's see what we have here, right? I can see that I have what looks like contact here. I can see that I have what looks like contact here. What looks like contact here. Might or might not be clear, right? Or possibly over here, might or might not be clear, where it looks like I have contact once as well. Now, I want to note that should make sense. We have a b of either positive 6 or negative 6, right? So, and that should make sense to us that we have two options in which we have singular contact between this downward facing quadratic and this line. So even though for right here we have for here we have an answer of 6, but we might need to add something within this that also states maybe your b value is greater than 0, right? So that gives you some additional parameters that we have to consider, or it should your b value is less than 0, so then it would be negative 6. But nonetheless, your main takeaway from this would be this is how we can use our slider to help us get to the information that we need to know. All right, this is how we can use our slider to help us get to the information that we need to know. All right, let's take a look here. All right, so in terms of data regression and tables, how can we use this to help us out, right? So let's take a look here. So I have a scatter plot. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. And hopefully you're given plots and points that are pretty legible, pretty clear for you to input, right? Because the most important thing is that we want you to be able to take the data they've been given, even if it's in scatter plot form, and then present that into a table, right? So here we have 11 points, and let's go to see what that table will look like. Here we have 11 points. So here we have that same table. And if you were to take those points that would have been provided on that side of the SAT and put them into the table, you would get something that looks like this, right? And now our expectation is, well, how are we going to how are we going to determine the information that we're looking for? And in this instance, let me zoom out. In terms of the question, we want to recognize that we have a best fit line, right? And we would like to figure out or evaluate and predict what is our y value when x is equal to 32. Now, and for the sake of this video, we know the answer is going to be 2.4. But how do we get to that 2.4? So as I said before, regressions are very helpful for us. And the last time we used a regression as related to a smaller table, where this is a little bit more data, that might not be as great of a fit, but that's okay. So let's input based on what we know in terms of regression. We can say y1 approximates to y1 m. Since we're dealing with a linear function, we'll say mx plus b would be on the other side of this regression. So n x1 plus b, right? Now, what's my r squared? Right, we said we wanted to be close to 1. And I'm not necessarily mad at this in terms of information, right? I know that just for the sake of making sure that we're confident, like, is this the best fit? Well, we could go on and put in a quadratic function. And we can see if we get a better r value. That didn't produce anything because I didn't have the right one. Right? Oh, technically, that's possibly a little bit better fit. But nonetheless, we're going to use a linear for this example. In fact, I want you to use that as a default in terms of your questions, right? Now, for the sake of this presentation, what would be your next step? What do we want to be able to do next? Right? So the next idea is, if I want to be able to predict what's the value that's missing there according to this line of best fit, according to the linear function that we're expecting, what we would do is we would say, hey, let's create a function, right? And let's have that function based on the parameters of the m that they provided in the regression, x, which is an unknown value and not an x for the table. I want to note here, this is not x1. We're creating a new equation that's based on the parameter that came from the old table. So I'm not using x1, I'm not using y1, right? So we have function is equal to mx plus b. Again, I want the m and I want the b from the previous function, right? This means that the system knows what equation that I'm trying to create, and it's based on those parameters. And I like this because now function has a meaning. I can now, instead of saying x, I can say 32, which is what we needed, right? Which is what we were requesting, right? And what does that provide us? So the x is equal to 32, our y should be 2.4. And that's how we get to that answer, right? So this is one of the best tools that we might use in terms of Desmos when dealing with data. This is one of the best tools that we might use in terms of Desmos when dealing with data, right? And then one of the last things we'll go over will be the use of data to find, or the use of Desmos for different stat functions, including particularly mean, median, and mode. Now, with regrets, in terms of using mode, not as helpful within Desmos, right? So the challenge is that with Desmos, anytime we're typing in mode, it ends up interpreting mod and the natural E. And that ends up giving us something that's not on our data set at all. So I don't want us to even deal with that. But you are going to insert a table. I already inserted this data since you have it listed. But I need you to be able to remember your definitions. Again, this is going to save us from understanding our concepts. So we should remember that mean is going to be our average. We should remember that median is going to be our middle number, our middle point, and our mode is going to be our most frequent or the most commonly seen number. In this case, hopefully you can look at the data set and say that the mode is 18. All right. So let's see. Let's go to 18. All right. So let's see. Let's go to awesome. All right. So this should be pretty helpful for us and pretty straightforward because, as I mentioned before, we have our keybat here, and we have our functions, right? And we have our statistical functions. I can say mean, and I can place in the variable that you would have typed into your table. In this case, it's x1, so I'll say x1. And look at that, the mean is produced for us, right? I could say median, and this time I'm typing it in, right? And I'll say x1, and look at that, it finds the middle number that would have been our x1 for this particular point or for this particular data set, right? So whether you remember the shorthand or not, I want you to make sure you remember that your functions are here and available to you in terms of everything that you might see, the higher yield ones being your mean, median, max, min, and your quartiles and quantiles. The higher yield ones being your mean, median, max, min, and your quartiles and quantiles. All right. So let's talk about just how to practice, right? So one of the biggest pitfalls that you can have and common traps you're going to think of are going to be typing errors. So one of the biggest because sometimes our confidence increases, we might end up moving a little faster. And I don't want you to move too fast. I never want you to think about time whenever you're sitting for the SAT. Time is on your side as long as we're thinking clearly. So let's make sure we're writing things down to think clearly. And one of the quickest things that we can add extra anxiety to us is to move quickly, and now we start typing in errors. Move slowly through because you have this tool that's going to help you out, right? And that way, as you're moving slowly through, you can then reduce your typing errors, right? Always make sure that you're zooming out. If you remember at the beginning of the lesson, I was pretty good about saying, hey, what am I looking at? Particularly if you're looking at graphs that need to adjust the window for. Always ask yourself. In fact, I would make it a habit to go ahead and zoom out. I would make that a default habit to go ahead and zoom out to make sure that you're at least seeing everything that you might need to see, right? Always remember that Desmos is a tool. It's not a be all end all. So when do you use it? I would say only use Desmos whenever you have come to the point in your computation where the aid of a graphing calculator is there for you, meaning that you should have some sort of setup. Once your setup is there, then you can add that as a tool, right? And then always check your variable output to make sure that's the variable that we're interested in, right? So remember the question we had in terms of, I think it was like raspberries and blackberries earlier. We always wanted to, we kept tabs of when we were going from R and B to X and Y, and we needed to make sure we were accounting for the right variable per what the question was asking, right? So be cognizant of that, and you're going to be good to go. Okay. This is just some kind of this is a checklist I wanted to provide to you. This is for test day. You can screenshot it. And this is just a couple of tools that might be I'm sorry, indications in your examination that you might want to think of. Could I use Desmos for? Right. So your highest yield presentations, if it meets one of these criteria, it might be good for you to use. Okay. Your highest yield presentation. And then, as always, no matter when you're looking at this, please make sure that you do. Hey, you can do a couple of practice questions before your test, right? Usually, the day before a test, I'm not recommending you do a ton of work. That is your rest day. But doing a couple of questions that are Desmos related, maybe a couple, not a lot, no more than 5, 10 max, that are Desmos related, just to make sure that you are still in rhythm, that you know how to maneuver through the interface would be good. Always make sure you do a practice test. Focus on the higher yield presentation for Desmos. Notice how I didn't go into the things you might see on a one-off. I'll probably end up making another video for those later. But I don't want you to, I don't want that to be at the forefront of your mind, especially the day before the exam. And as well, make sure that you're doing questions. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I don't have my email written here on the slide, but I will type that in here now. I don't have my email written here on the slide, but I will. You can always reach me at Donovan Evans Tutoring. You can always reach me at Donovan Evans Tutoring.com. And you can also visit my website where you'll see my tutoring calendar, can also contact me on any of and you could also follow me on any of the social channels that you see there at Donovan Evans Tutoring. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that it was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Best of luck. You're going to do great. To watch this video. I hope that it was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.